But I do always want to thank you so much for joining us for another Mornings with O'Keefe program, a monthly lecture series that we love to do on the first Wednesday of each month. For those of you who maybe have never joined before, my name is Molly. I manage adult programs at the museum, and it's always a pleasure to be able to do this program, and we appreciate you joining. I'd like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today because it's from support that you provide that we're able to do free programs like Mornings with O'Keeffe. If you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining. You can learn more about membership benefits at gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum website in about 8 weeks' time. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters this morning. We are joined and honored to be joined by Michael Namingha and Arlo Namingha, artists and brothers, among many other things, but who are also collaborators and participators in the O'Keeffe Museum special exhibition, Tewa Nangeh, Tewa Country. And today we're going to have a conversation and learn from both Michael and Arlo about their creative practices, the pieces that are in the exhibition, and some more about the process of what it was like to be a part of the creation of that exhibit. So Michael and Arlo, it's wonderful to see you this morning, and thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Sange Tamu, good morning. I'm glad to be here.
Great. And to kick off the conversation, I think we'll just get started right at the beginning. Would you mind sharing with us how you became to be professional artists, what your artistic journey looked like from the beginning to now? And we had talked about starting with Arlo because your name starts with A, but really we can, whoever wants to start, please go ahead.
Okay, or as Mike would say, age before beauty. I think for us, I've always talked about we've had a really unique introduction to the arts. Having a father who was a professional artist, we always had access to his studio, and then we come from a long lineage of artisans in our family from the Nambé family. So our great grandmother is Nambé, who was recognized for bringing back the traditions of Hopi pottery making. And then her daughter was Annie, and then her daughter, my great grandmother, is Rachel, and my grandmother Dextra. They were all ceramists, and I actually learned how to create pottery from my grandmother, spending all the time out at Hopi, partaking in ceremonies, and then also that part of it too. Just fortunately growing up with our traditions and partaking in our ceremonies, whether it's creating a garment or the regalia and things we use, the rattles, and I became a Katsina doll carver for that purpose at a very young age. So I learned that from my father and my uncles. So like that creativity was always just there. And as for following the footsteps, I guess, I don't know if Michael and I were quite too sure if that's what we wanted to do. Um, I came in on the business side of our gallery initially. I managed the gallery, Niman Fine Art, with my mom for about initially the first 10 years, all the while doing commissions quietly. I studied more architecture and being a draftsman, and I don't know, I guess eventually the carvings and my studies met somewhere in the middle. My wife came into the picture, working here at the gallery, took care of all my duties, which enables me to make a mess every day now. So, um, fortunate to be living the life of an artist and creating. So, and being a long part of this long family lineage, it's just been pretty special. So we hand that off to Michael.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Um, Yeah, so my family lived on the reservation in Ohkay Owingeh until I was in the fourth grade, and then we moved to Santa Fe, where I spent the rest of my childhood. Um, but like my brother said, we always had sort of access to my father's studio growing up. Um, and so from an early age, I was always reading art magazines that my dad had lying around and different art books. And, the magazines were usually Art Forum or Art in America, Art News, whatever. So I was always very, I guess, keenly aware of what was going on in the art world outside of Santa Fe. Because at that time, um, I guess the artwork created in the Southwest wasn't necessarily being covered like it is today, which is interesting to also witness. Um, and so I was always fascinated with what was going on outside of this place that I was so familiar with and looking at specifically New York City. And so my father also had camera equipment lying around his studio, which I picked up and just started experimenting with and using. And these were analog, old school 35 millimeter cameras. And so, waiting for development and all of that to happen rather than this instantaneous, instant gratification we get today. So I think for my 14th, 13th birthday, my dad gave me my own camera because he sort of like, okay, you can stop using my equipment. Here's your own. Um, and so in that way, I guess it was very informed about utilizing photography in my own artistic practice. So I've really been doing it since I was a teenager. And then at the same time, I was taking classes at the Santa Fe Art Institute. They had a different type of programming back then. This was in the 90s. Um, and they would invite well-known artists to come over the period of a summer program where they would have these master classes. And so I was able to take classes with John Baldessari and Judy Pfaff and Fritz Scholder and Manuel Neri. And I was always the youngest person in these classes because most of the other participants were already practicing artists or retired folks that wanted to explore their artistic activities. And so, in a sense, it was very informative for me to learn from these artists and also, garner some advice from them about, well, you're a professional artist. What should I do? But also being, I guess, in the shadow of my father, who at the time, was very well-known figure in the Santa Fe art scene. And I also kind of wanted to separate myself as far as I could from that. And so I ended up going to Parsons School of Design in New York City, not for fine art, but for strategic design and management, because I thought I wanted to go into the fashion industry, but kind of more on the marketing and business side of things. Um, but of course, as my brother mentioned, we come from a long line of artists, starting with our great 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 grandmother, and it's just kind of hard not to be an artist, I guess. It's just inherently in us, and so I guess as much as I tried to not be, I ended up becoming. So that's sort of my my story.
Always.
You're me.
It wouldn't be a Mornings with O'Keefe if I were not muted at some point. But thank you both for sharing a little bit about your journey to your current art careers, which at the beginning of the top of the conversation, we mentioned that you're both participating, your collaborators and participants in the current O'Keefe Museum exhibition, Tewa Nangeh, Tewa Country. And I would encourage anyone who's joining from near or far to please investigate this exhibition further. We also have a Mornings with O'Keefe program from earlier in the year with co-curators Bess Murphy and Jason Garcia that dives a bit more into that exhibition and its full scope. But I would love to hear from both of of you how your participation in the exhibition came to be, what that collaboration process was like, and anything else you'd like to share about being a part of that project. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a couple pictures.
Arlo, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, with me, I was approached by Jason. I ran into him, I think, just at a local restaurant here, and he talked about the project that he was working on. And this was, um, this project was, it took some time. It was probably a couple of years in the making, if my calculations are correct. And so he asked me if I would be a willing participant. And then I think he ran into my brother Michael while they were at the Colby and asked him as well. Um, I found it exciting and interesting what he was wanting to do and put together with Bess. So I agreed to take part in the project and told him to keep me in the loop. It was a very unique process. Like I've always mentioned, I've been part of various exhibitions that were curated and participated in projects like this, but this one was very unique because Jason and Bess and the way they approached it was having us all as participants involved from day one. And we had meetings, field trips, listened to art perspectives, and really valued, I think, all our individual input of what our thoughts and ideas were. We had several discussions, several meetings throughout the process, which I found very unique and really appreciative of being part of this particular project. And everything that I think that's in the exhibition from each one of us, I think we're all able to really put forth what we really wanted to do. It wasn't because normally a curator will come in and select some pieces that maybe they think will fit into what they have in the theme, but we're actually able to really give our voice and our thought and our idea and our creativity and put forth what each individual wanted to do. So it was a very unique process to work with this group.
Yeah, so my experience, so this is my second time exhibiting at the O'Keeffe Museum. I was invited to exhibit in 2018, and the exhibition then was titled Michael Namingha, or Georgia O'Keeffe and Michael Namingha, The Black Place. And so I was exploring O'Keeffe's Black Place series and sort of my response to that particular body of work. And I worked with Carolyn Kastner, the curator at the time, on that exhibition. So I guess my approach was I was familiar with how to look at some of O'Keeffe's different bodies of work, and I did zero in on that specific series, the Black Place series, but while I was kind of narrowing it down, I, came across a bunch of different paintings that really struck me. And so I think as an artist that's exploring a certain bodies of work by another artist, it's fun to kind of go down these different rabbit holes. And so you end up with one body of work, but you're always kind of wanting to explore additional works from different series. And so I was in Maine at Colby Museum of Art for an exhibition titled Painted Our Bodies, Hearts, and Village in 2023. That was also an interesting exhibition, sort of in the same vein as this. It was primarily Puebloan artists that were responding to works by the Taos School of Artists. And so for the opening weekend, there were a group of the artists that were included in the exhibit that made the trip to Waterville, Maine, for the opening. And Jason Garcia was one of the participants. And so we were getting shuttled around campus and to Portland, and he mentioned this exhibition that he was planning. And so we just, spent time on this shuttle van from Waterville to Portland talking about it. And it sounded like an interesting opportunity, because it was the sort of first time that native voices of this area were able to collectively respond to an artist who has become sort of iconic for being a representation of the Southwestern landscape, but from a modernist kind of standpoint and on a global scale. I mean, you can't go anywhere without someone knowing who Georgia O'Keeffe is. And, some people love her, some people don't, some people, there's an aura around her. Um, and so I think the artist that Jason ended up working with, um, it was really interesting to see their perspectives because not all of them are practicing artists. We have some scholars on the team as well. And so we were, assigned these field trips by Jason and Bess and really kind of exploring how we responded to places that are so familiar to us. But also it was engaging because we were able to hear everyone's opinion on these different field trips. And in this photo, you see us sitting around a table, which, is also very familiar to me growing up in the Pueblos, because often these conversations that happen always happen around the kitchen table because our families always live so close to one another on the reservation. And mealtime is always a great time to catch up with other family members and feast days. Um, so it was an interesting process. And like my brother said, sometimes a show is curated by a curator and they pick a specific body of work or works. And in this way, it was very sort of organic, and we were able to explore and kind of feel where we were comfortable, and what we were comfortable with. And some of the installations in the gallery, like Eliza Naranjo Moore's piece, is site specific, and she's talking about land and emotions, and I feel like it's a really engaging experience for the viewers. If for those of you who have not seen the exhibit, hopefully you'll have a chance to see it before it comes down in November. But yeah, so I guess in closing, that was just a really unique experience for me that I hope other museums kind of maybe look at this type of platform, to engage with artists and the curatorial team or teams. I think another exhibit that felt somewhat similar to me was Grounded in Clay, in that there were, I think, 60 curators, scholars, artists, that were chosen to select pieces from the collection at the School for Advanced Research and the Vilcek Foundation in New York City, and then write essays of how we respond to those pieces and what they mean to us. But it was also done during COVID, so a lot of our meetings were done over Zoom, and it was really interesting to see the practicing artists that, I remember Rose Simpson was creating a sculpture, one of her sculpture pieces in the background while she's engaging with this curatorial team. And so you just don't see or witness experiences like that, or at least I hadn't prior to that. And so I think this is a unique opportunity for museums to think about programmatically.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing more about what it was like to be a part of that planning process. And yes, as Michael said, this exhibition runs until November, so there's still plenty of time to come and visit. We have other programs, an in-person talk coming up in August, for instance. So plenty more time to be able to engage with all of the pieces in the exhibition. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and talk about the specific pieces that both of you have in the exhibition. Both of you have multiple works, and this would be a great time to hear from each of you about the physical process for creating the pieces or the conceptual process for what went into those as well. And we also have some images, and audience, we also have some video, and so bear with us if there's some buffering or things that are happening. We did do some tests, but you should be able to get a really great view into some of the creative process here. So let's start with you, Arlo. Here's a couple images that you sent, and here is an image or images of all three of the works that are currently in Tewa Nangeh, Tewa Country.
Okay, yeah. Well, I have the three pieces that are in the exhibition. And again, just um, partaking with the discussions that everybody had and points of view, and um, having the opportunity to speak to specific pieces that O'Keeffe had created, quotes that she's made, things of that nature, is kind of was my approach and the thought process of what I've created. Um, so I have Sandhills, which is the piece where the little guy's standing right behind, which is the two pieces. There's the Bashare, which is in the center, and then the one Sandhills. Those are interactive works. I've always felt that art creates thought, idea, conversation, and dialogue. So a lot of my pieces are interactive. Um, so I think dialogue, there's a lot of dialogue that is lacking these days. So I like to invite a viewer or collector to be involved and participate in creating different compositions with my pieces. The Sandhills piece, um, in fact, Nicole, can you get me the little, I have a maquette here actually, of Sandhills. And it relates to the land. Um, and it's a place out at Hopi that I thought about. And what it relates to is the idea of how things change over time, um, but how we view Mother Nature. Um, so I thought of this location out at Hopi, which is Sand Hills. It's located behind First Mesa. And I've always been asked, was it like, because, you know, we have a business here in Santa Fe. We live here. We do go back to Ohkay Owingeh as well as out at Hopi. What is it like um, when you go home? Do things change? And I thought about that for a long time. And the answer is yes. Things change over time. Um, there's, you know, people pass on, new kids are born. Um, some of the dwellings are eroding away, but still have a strong substance to them. But there's always that constant change of life. But I incorporated four pieces in that Sandhills piece, which the one thing that has stayed a constant is our culture, our traditions, our ceremonies, the language. And so the reason why there's four pieces in that particular piece is because it relates to our symbolism of the four cardinal directions, north, east, south, and west. And then there's also some notches in one of the pieces. In fact, I'll show the small little maquette here, and so you can see the notches in here, negative space in there. And that refers to the same thing, which refers to the four cardinal directions, but also relates to those windows and doorways. Two places like, say, Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, places that we have strong ties to, things that places we still sing about during ceremonies. So of very strong importance to us, and the idea of that, uh, how we revere the land and these sacred places, and the importance of them. And then the cylinder that you see floating on there, that refers to Tawa, which is the sun, which so as the sun rises and sets, things change over time. So it's telling that story of, again, life changes, but the one thing that has stayed constant is our culture and our traditions, and trying to keep that going, and just sharing that perspective.
Mm.
And then the Bashade piece, the one that's you see in the center, that's really Bashade is what that means is a deer dance. And so it's a very minimal and contemporary way to share the symbolism about our deer dance at our Pueblo at Ohkay Owingeh. I used a symmetrical, asymmetrical design to it. Again, it has the 4 cardinal directions because it's in 4 pieces. You see the 4 notches in there as well. So that piece can completely be disassembled. You can create various different compositions. There's a control break technique that I utilize. And in the interior, there's some texture that will lock all the pieces back together. And you can see it's in 2 different tonalities. And the reason I did that is to represent when we're partaking in these ceremonies, we have a winter clan and we have a summer clan. And so that's representing the 2 clans. In fact, I went now that we're now into the summer and spring months, I flipped the piece over to recognize the summer clans. And so during the winter months, when we first opened the exhibition, it was flipped the other way. And so, there's those elements part of this exhibition that we're able to incorporate as well. But I decided to use this piece or create this piece was because to address O'Keeffe's, how she collected these bones for still lifes and so forth. And I just wanted to share how we actually revere the animal and how we respect the animal and how it provides for the culture and the ceremony. And in the morning, it's a very sacred part of the particular ceremony, and so I did it in a very minimal way to display what happens during the morning in a respectful manner. So it's not very literal. So those 4 pieces also represent the deer hoofs and the tracks. And the reason for the symmetrical and asymmetrical design is when there's usually 200 plus of us participants taking part in this particular ceremony, and we come running down from the foothills into the Pueblo where the women and the singers are waiting for the blessings, and we come running down in a zigzag pattern. And so that's why I have it in the particular zigzag pattern there to represent that movement during the morning. And so that's what all this kind of relates to, is just telling those stories of how we respect the animals and how we revere it, and the importance of ceremony and so forth. And then the one on the right, which is it's titled Teeping, or the Paternal piece. And so that's speaking to O'Keeffe's, she painted this location, the Paternal Butte, many times over. And she was also quoted as saying, if I paint it enough, God will give it to me. And so I thought about that. And so I decided to create this piece, Teeping, and do it more of in a geological perspective of relating to the land, of it being in a timeline, and that we're not really true owners of this land, Mother Earth, but we're really just stewards for the short time that we're here, and how we should nurture her and take care of her for the future. And so I use various different elements. The main housing is out of stone, and I incorporated various different types of wood in the piece. The butte's created out of wood. And then I have Owingeh that's in there, and then I also have a Texas shell, which is the OC bed floor, just to tell that kind of story of the history of the land. And then there's some poplar with a green to kind of refer to the idea of the movement of the rivers through the area, and just kind of letting those natural materials tell that story. And so that's why I did it more of in a timeline perspective. And so, and I'm working on a huge series right now relating to that particular piece. So that's the reason why I chose these particular three pieces. And so there's stone pieces, and then there's that interactive stone works, and then the Sandhills piece is actually all bronze.
Thank you so much for sharing an overview of the three pieces. And we do have some images as well of you actually creating some of these pieces or all of these pieces. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what's happening in this one with the bronze?
Okay, so the bronze, so you can see that's all actually fabricated there. I worked with a master fabricator here in town, Bill Weaver, who used to actually run Shidoni Foundry. When it comes to my bigger projects, I definitely trust Bill. He's kind of taking me under his wing. Every time I take a project up there, he tends to look at me and say, "You want to try what?" You know, we actually had to engineer, put a table together just to create this particular piece. It's probably one of the most complicated fabrications that I've done so far, just because every single piece has to fit together. I do have the original maquette here, which was actually created out of wood, and then it was scaled up and then all fabricated. So you can see in the images there that all those pieces actually do fit and click together. And then you can see that image of me kind of playing with it on the right. You can really shift those pieces and put them in various different compositions. They're designed to where you can actually stand them up, you can lie them down. Kind of also has that playful element to it too, which as my wife calls them, my Hopi Legos.
And I think we have an image, oh yes, here of some of the different ways that you have arranged the composition.
There
And
you go.
yeah, and my understanding is between now and the exhibition's close, will there be any more arrangements that we can see of the
I
piece?
have been talking with Bess and about maybe doing some programming or something at some point to where I can come in and demonstrate and show how these pieces can be put in various different compositions like you're seeing in the photos there. So the one on the right, and that's the small maquette that I had created and just showing the various compositions. But the larger scale is all fabricated, so it's hollow, so they're actually manageable. It's each panel is 3 feet in length. I believe the cylinder is about 16, 18 inches in diameter. But them being fabricated, they are manageable and you can move them. And again, they're all balanced. And then since I work with a lot of natural material, wood and stone, I tend to want to warm up the bronze. So I work with a young woman, Britt Weaver, and also another gentleman, Frank Marbello in town, developing all these various different patinas, which is applying the chemical to the bronze and various different chemicals to create different colorizations and layerings because I wanted kind of having that element of earth and kind of that essence of stone to the bronze. So um, I tend to want to manipulate and warm up the bronze that way, and so that's why you see that colorization there. And then that cylinder was actually created out of wood initially, so I just kind of mimic that to represent which is the sun, the rising of the sun, and then the setting of the sun, and the timeline, and how that changes over time.
It's very cool to see all the different ways you can view the piece. And when I first saw the sculpture, I thought those longer elements were stone. So it was
Yeah.
really interesting to learn that they're in fact the bronze. And we have a couple images of you working, showing how you mentioned earlier messy your style of work is.
Yes, it's very messy, as my wife says, as far away from the house as possible. So I have a large studio space where I do all my stone and woodwork and things of that nature. Have a different facility or space where I create all the jewelry and drawings and prints and things. And then when I work with the larger bronze pieces, I usually work with Bill Weaver up in his space there in Trocadero. So yeah, I have various different locations that I have to keep separate.
And I believe a couple views as well of the Deer Dancer piece.
Mhm.
And we talked about including an image of Georgia O'Keeffe's one of her Pedernal paintings to put with your sculpture. And maybe you can explain just a little bit more about the connection between these two with the closer up view of the sculpture.
Yeah, so as I kind of talked to a little bit earlier was basically that kind of thought and idea, and then that quote that she has been known for, and just thinking about, ownership of locations of that, and because this place is kind of it's these locations here in New Mexico. There are a lot of sacred locations for us, places that we tend to make pilgrimages to and things of that nature. And so that's why I did it in this particular way of doing it more of in a timeline, and how, again, how we really view Mother Nature, and how, like I said, we're truly, it's not a pure ownership, it's stewards of the land and taking care of her and nurturing her as much as possible. And just showing, the different elements and the layers of how long Mother Earth has been here, and we're only here for a short moment. And so um, just looking at it in that particular perspective.
Absolutely. And I believe we have some process images of this piece as well, and our first attempt at the video. So let's see if we can watch you actually at work here. Sped up.
Yeah, making a mess.
And so how long does a piece like this take to fabricate?
Well, that's the thing is working with natural material is definitely very different than say working with bronze or something like that. I mean, that is a challenge in its own right, but when you're working with natural material, I always say it's more of a relationship. There's a song and dance. Again, it's working with Mother Nature. Um, Definitely keeps you humble because you're working with a natural material, and there's usually, you really have to think things through. You can't really go back and cut again. And then the other thing is when you're working with these larger pieces of stone, you're not really sure what's going to be in the interior. And so there's always these things that are surprises or elements that come about. And so you kind of have this thought process, and you execute it that way. And but then there again, it's more of a relationship. So it just depends. Sometimes they come out with what you really wanted them to do, but then again, there's a lot of times where there's surprises that arise, and so you adapt and you move on that way. So especially with the interactive works where I'm fragmenting and breaking apart the stones. It's a process that I learned from my great grandfather. He was a stonemason, so I used to hang out with him when I was a young kid out at Hopi and watching him fracture all these stones. And so I actually was utilizing that process out of necessity because I don't really have assistants in my studio. And so I was breaking down these larger slabs of stone to get to the source that I wanted to. And then I started to realize that I could really control the break. And so I started really trying to practice and execute that. And so that texture was locking all these pieces back together. And so that's how the interactive pieces kind of developed. And then I eventually engineered my own chisels in a way that I use these thin curve uh, wood carving chisels, and then I welded various different carbide tips to it so I could really control the protrusion and how these pieces all click and lock together. So, I mean, the process with working with natural material, like I said, it just can vary. And then when you're trying to break stones apart, it's taking a deep breath and hoping everything works out correctly. I think I've somewhat mastered it, but there's tonality that comes in, the octave change as you're about to fracture the stone, and you hope it works out well. But again, it's more of a relationship with the material.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about the pieces in the exhibition. And for those of you watching, stay tuned. Maybe you have seen the exhibition, but if you come back again, those pieces may have changed, or perhaps you'll have a chance to see Arlo actually changing them. So yes, that's wonderful. Thank you, Arlo. We really appreciate that perspective.
Sure.
So Michael, let's shift to the pieces that you have on exhibit. There are two pieces, but let's get started with the large piece that's been in many photographs of the exhibition, and it's become kind of an iconic piece of the exhibition. So looking forward to learning more about that one.
Yeah, well, thank you, Arlo, for your presentation. It's funny because, we are very an artistic family, but all our studios are separate, so it's kind of nice to see inside his studio because I'm never there. Um, this is fun. Thank you. So the piece or photograph that we're looking at here is a photo I took in 2022. So you're looking, or I was looking east from the turnoff to Chimayo. And so viewers that are not sure where Chimayo is, it's about 30 miles north of Santa Fe on a kind of two-lane road. And so the Hermit's Peak fire was the largest forest fire on record for the state of New Mexico, and it began as a controlled burn in April of that year, and it burned for, I think, 5 months, consuming 340,000 acres. But over the course of those 5 months, periodically these pyrocumulonimbus clouds would appear, and as you see, it it looks like an atomic bomb cloud because a pyrocumulonimbus cloud is created either by the intense heat of a forest fire, the a volcanic eruption, or a nuclear explosion. So those three instances are all tied to this particular cloud. When it's a forest fire that creates one, it's basically pulling all of the ash and soot up into the upper atmosphere, creating this anvil-shaped cloud that oftentimes creates its own weather system because it's so massive. And over time, what does happen is all of those particulates that are getting sucked up remain in the upper atmosphere for a period of, I think, up to 6 months to a year. And over the course of that time, they start to kind of filter back down into the earth. So not only are we breathing this toxic air during the forest fire, but over the course of, it's coming back to earth, we're also breathing in some of those toxicities. And for this particular series, it really started. I was in a program in New York City called New Ink, which is the only, or I think it's the only museum-led incubator project in the country. And I was I was a little frustrated being in that program because it really was more for artists that were using um, they sort of had like a side hustle for how they were going to market themselves. And so as a practicing artist, I was having a hard time kind of finding my purpose there. And there is this occurrence that happens, and it's actually happening now in Manhattan, and it's called Manhattanhenge. And it's when the sun is setting, but it aligns perfectly with the buildings. And there was one sunset, I think it happened in June of that year that I was there, it was 2019. But the sun that was setting was this bright orange color. And it was so intense that it had stopped traffic. And so all of these people were taking photographs of it. And it was before kind of the Instagram effect of what Manhattanhenge has become, where so many people go to Times Square just to take this setting sun photo. Um, and so it really piqued my interest because I was wondering what caused this effect to the sun to have this really bright color. And it turns out there were forest fires in Canada that were happening at the time. And so that smoke was filtering down into New York City. And so I finally, it was like kind of the program coming to a conclusion at New Ink, but it was finally like, oh, okay, now this is why I came here. And it triggered a moment in my body of work, which led me to embark on my Altered Landscape series, which is recording these forest fires that are happening in the Southwest. And so this particular photograph began kind of a new iteration of that series, but it's called the Disaster series. And the piece that's at the O'Keeffe is Disaster number 8. And it is utilizing a photo silkscreen process. And so that was partly also where the title of the series came from, because it was my sort of quiet nod to Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series that he had started in the 1960s, which was talking primarily about car crashes and suicides, but also like tuna fish disasters. And so my series is more looking at environmental disasters. And fortunately or unfortunately, that title of disaster, it kind of it gives you ongoing content to record, or at least gives me ongoing content to record. And so a lot of people always sometimes ask me because my photo images are altered, and they often want to see what the original photo image looks like. And so here it is. And if we can slide forward. And so for this particular series, because of the air quality index, this is the air quality index color chart that we're looking at. And during the course of that 5 months of the Hermit's Peak fire, I feel like we were living according to how it was the safety in which we were able to engage with the outdoors environment. And so often the particulates in the air were pretty high. And so they were, it was on the high end of the scale. Um, and in the piece that I created for the O'Keeffe, it's made up of yellow, oranges, and reds, because of the air quality during that period. And if you slide forward, um, I was also responding to a particular painting by O'Keeffe. This was done in 1945. And the date also resonated with me because um, in my work, the pyrocumulonimbus cloud is created by forest fire, intensity, volcanic eruption, or nuclear explosion. And so O'Keeffe was painted this painting in 1945 when the nuclear bomb was created in Los Alamos. And I also learned that Georgia O'Keeffe had a fallout shelter at her studio and home in Abiquiu, and so she was acutely aware of what was happening environmentally as well during that period. And there's a quote that goes along with this series, which I'm just going to butcher and um, make much smaller. But basically, she was saying by the time that mankind is finished with this earth, all we will have left is the blue sky. And so she was thinking about the destruction of the planet much in the way that is happening to it today and how I'm responding to that. But if you look at this painting, it incorporates the same colors that are incorporated in my work, which are yellow, reds, and oranges. And if you slide forward, this is our color mixing process. So my studio is actually in Brooklyn, New York. I work with a silk screening studio there called Powerhouse Arts, and I work with them primarily because they are able to create large scale photo silk screens. The piece at the O'Keeffe measures 90 by 58 inches, and I've since created works with them. I just completed a commission that was 16 feet long by 70 inches. So we're able to work on these really large scale pieces. And so this is acrylic ink that we're mixing here. And these are the colors that are incorporated into the piece. If you slide forward, this is how we transfer the original photo image to this sheet of mylar that then gets placed onto this gigantic exposing machine that we then put this silk screen on top of, and then light is shown through this kind of film negative and then is transferred onto the silk screen. So in the next video, I think we'll see what the negative image looks like on that film. And then the next slide is utilizing that exposing machine to transfer that negative onto the screen itself. And these screens, I think, measure, I don't know, something like 100 inches by 70. And we use a 195 mesh for this particular project, just because it allows us to get all of the detailing of the photo image onto the surface of the canvas. And then after this screen is exposed and the image is transferred onto the silk screen, we then power wash it, which reveals the image. And here's Zaire. She's power washing and taking off sort of the excess film. And then you can see that what's left is what the ink will then get transferred through onto the canvas. And so since this is a 5-color silk screen, there are 5 of these screens that are used, and one is used for each color, and one contains different elements of the photo image itself. And then the next video is so at the back of the background of the screen print is a gradient print, and so that's what we're printing here, sort of that base color. And when the screen comes up, you'll see that how that gradient is utilized. And as you can see, I mean, there's a team of 7 of us that are working all at once when these screens are pooled, and the screens are heavy and they're awkward and they're big, and so we're trying to wipe up the excess ink and also just make sure that nothing goes splattering all over the place. And so the next video, I guess, is the first elements of the photo image going onto the surface. And you can see that this one is, we're mixing into the photo image kind of the orange colored inks. So after we get most of the, I think, images and colors laid onto the surface, then sort of the last elements of the photo image and the last color go onto the screen. But before we do that, we laid, if you slide forward, we laid this film on top that is kind of this maroon color, since that last the last colored ink that will go on is red. And so we wanted to see how it's going to interact with the other colors. And so the last video here is the last and final sort of image with all of the colors going on. And then the final element that went with this piece was a clear varnish that was incorporated into sort of this area of the cloud only. So when you go to the exhibit, if you look closely, you can see that there's sort of this shiny element to the work. And I like creating these sort of like, I guess I call them Easter eggs into my works so people can find little elements that maybe you don't recognize until you kind of start moving around the piece. And so the last slide in this is the final image, which is 58 by 90 inches. And you can kind of see the gradient background, how it's kind of this brighter yellow at the bottom that kind of transfers up into this more orange texture and color. And so this is one of two pieces of mine that's in the exhibit. The other is a piece titled I Hate Flowers. And so you can see it was done in 2013. And so I have been exploring sort of the O'Keeffe concept or idea for a while now. And this series, Abiquiu, there are other pieces of it's the same photo image, but the text is different. One says I hate flowers, one says O'Keeffe aesthetic, one has the zip code for Abiquiu. And what I was looking at was I guess how we think of O'Keeffe as this icon of the Southwest, of this woman that, moved from New York City and lived in the desert by herself. And um, as someone from New Mexico, I feel like I did the opposite. I'm this native New Mexican that moved to New York. And so we kind of did the opposite things. But with this piece, I Hate Flowers, it's actually a quote by O'Keeffe where she said, I hate flowers, but they don't move and are cheaper to use than live models, which I thought was so ironic and just funny, just how we think about O'Keeffe's work, because I think we're also familiar with her flower series. Um, and so, like I said, I think this landscape in particular in Abiquiu has always resonated with me just because when I was growing up, we used to take family kind of day trips in our car to different areas in New Mexico. And there's a place not far from Abiquiu called Echo Canyon Amphitheater, where it's this rock formation in the side of these cliffs that when you walk up to it, it's sort of curved. And when you yell, it reverberates your voice back. So I remember driving by this rock formation as a kid. And so it really, this kind of series is also about memory and how I think about this landscape. And so the piece next to it is a large scale silk screened work from my Altered State series that is talking about disappearing landscapes. And in this body of work, I was really looking at Hopi prophecy and how it relates to Japanese literature, just because I read a lot of Japanese literature. And there's a particular book that I read recently titled The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. And she was talking about in the book how these elements of our lives slowly disappear. Like one day they wake up, this little village where everyone lives, and roses are all of a sudden have disappeared. Or one day birds, they recognize that there's no longer these birds singing outside. And so, in a sense, I feel like that's happening to our environment. Like every day, I feel like I'm reading a news story of something that has gone away or is going away. And yesterday, I read a story about, this Trump administration had pulled back the restrictions for off-road vehicles on public lands. And those protections were put in place, I think, in the 70s during the Carter administration. And it also triggered like how artists work with environment. And the first artist I thought of was Michael Heiser and his motorcycle drawings, and how those were this kind of utilizing the land with a motor vehicle to create these drawings that were only visible from the air. Um, but I just wonder like what are the consequences of some of these programs being pulled back, and what we're going to have to deal with in the future, and how our environment is going to change even more so. Um, and on that happy note, but I wanted to thank everyone at the museum for this exhibition, because it's been such a rewarding experience, and also thanking the artists that are included in the exhibit, because it's been great to share a stage with them, share the space with them. The opening weekend was a lot of fun, and also to thank the team, or my team that I have at Powerhouse Arts in New York City, because without them, this piece would not have come to fruition. And without the museum and the artists and Bess and Jason, this exhibit wouldn't have come to fruition. So thank you all. And thank you all for joining us today. I don't know if we're on questions now.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you both. And these final images are just some pictures from the opening, which I think estimates were over 1,000 people attended the opening of this exhibition, which was incredible. And I also just want to take a moment to thank you both for sharing about your work and literally inviting us into your studios with your videos and pictures and explaining these works. It's been really, really lovely to talk with you today. And I will stop sharing and see. We have a few moments for questions from the audience. And if folks are a little shy about asking questions, which sometimes happens, I always have a question of my own, which is I'd love to know from both of you, uh, since the exhibition has opened, have there been any impacts or experiences or things that have come up that have been exciting that you'd want to share with us?
Yeah, sure. We've had great feedback. As you know, we have a gallery here in town. We're a couple blocks away from the O'Keefe. And so we've had several people that have attended the exhibit and they come through the gallery and sharing with us that they're great to see that this has happened. It's a powerful exhibition. They love the message and so forth. So it's been nothing but positivity. And then as you saw, I have the small original maquette of Sandhills here. So they're able to come over and actually play with the particular piece and see what it does and interact with it. And so there's that element as well. And so I think they're enjoying that also. So yep. So if you want to come on and mess around with the small maquette of Sandhills, please, you're welcome to come over into the gallery. My wife Nicole and my mother Frances are always here in the gallery. They're the ones that run the house and keep us boys in line.
Important work. Great. Okay, we do have Cheryl is wondering, first she's seen the exhibit and loves it, but also if you Arlo could remind us where your gallery is and what it's called.
Yes, the gallery is Niman Fine Art. We're located here on 125 Lincoln Avenue. Niman in Hopi means home or returning home. We do travel a lot and uh, travel out to various locations, whether it's exhibitions or whatnot. But since this is kind of our home base and our home location, Niman means home or returning home. So that's the name for the gallery. But we've been here, gosh, 36 years this year that we
Wow.
just celebrated now in May. So yeah,
Congratulations. That's a
thank
wonderful
you.
anniversary to celebrate. I think we have time to round out the talk with just one more question, which for each of you If you could think, if there's one thing that you hope folks walk away with, or a thought or a feeling after viewing the exhibition or your works in particular, what might that be?
For me, I think it would be kind of a understanding on how important the landscape, this whole region, um, is the importance it is to our culture and the Tewa culture, and um, how we revere this locate this entire New Mexico location, and just how important the land is to us.
Yeah, I think that we talk about O'Keefe's quote referring to ownership, and I think thinking of this landscape in more terms of stewardship is something that I would like people to walk away with. Also, I think just contemplation of spending time with each one of the works, and because I think each artist represents a different idea of how this what this land means to them and what this place and space means to them. If you look at Randy Silva's work, he's really documenting, I think, in a painterly technique, our ceremonies that happen. And Shireen's video is very poignant, and her interviews with each one of the artists allowed us to talk about our works from a personal standpoint. And I think for me, for a lot of my work is it always deals with some sort of environmental issue, and so I think in this world that we live in of scrolling and texting and Instagram and whatever, I think it's nice to have just contemplation about images that you're able to kind of sit in front of and just take in and experience and think about. And oftentimes that's why I like to choose colors that kind of draw a viewer in so that they have something to respond to and then dig a little bit deeper as to what those colors represent and mean.
Mm. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both for your answer to that question, and also for all of your time that you spent with us today, but also preparing your works for the exhibition and all the work that you're doing as artists overall. We really appreciate it. And before we close out, were there any final comments or thoughts that either of you wanted to share before we say goodbye?
No.
Well, for me, I'd just like to reiterate what my brother said, and just want to thank the team over at the O'Keefe, and all the fellow artists. It's been a pleasure to work with the entire team putting this exhibition together. It was really, it has been and still continues to be a really great experience. And we look forward to any of the programming that's going to be coming up.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks to you both. And yes, for those of you watching, stay tuned. There's more to come. There's lots of time between now and November when the exhibition closes. So we will have more to share programming wise in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, thank you again for being with us today. Thank you in the audience for tuning in. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. And until next time, have a lovely week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.